Good evening. My name is Lisa Cottrell. I'm a graduate student studying international relations at American Military University. I want to welcome you to this presentation covering a simulation exercise involving the Chechen crisis and the role that Track 2 diplomacy can play in resolving their conflict. The objectives for this presentation will be to first look at the importance and purpose of using a simulation exercise as a technique for understanding problem solving. Secondly, we're going to spend most of our time discussing why Track 2 diplomacy can be so effective in modern-day conflict resolution. Then we'll move on to identifying what factors can aid in paving the way to a successful end state. Then you'll be presented with some resources in which you can find some more information about this topic. And lastly, we'll wrap up with what we were able to actually gain by participating in this exercise. Alright, so to begin with, simulation exercises are a great way to jumpstart the problem-solving process. We actually do this to some extent on a day-to-day basis. When we're presented with any sort of problem, it is not atypical for us to try and resolve the problem through role-playing and our own minds. We try to gain perspective by imagining another person's point of view, we look at the problem from as many angles as we can think of, and we analyze possible outcomes. By simulating a number of the roles from various sectors of society from both Russia and Chechnya, we can more accurately assess, one, that there are many trains of thought when it comes to conflict resolution, and two, we can gain better insight and understanding from other individuals' point of view. As we become immersed in our character or characters we represent, our viewpoints can actually morph such that it broadens our viewpoint and allows for new ideas to infiltrate our mindset, eventually culminating with a vastly larger pool of information for us to build on as we go forward in our education or decision making in the future. All of this takes place in an imitation environment, which also allows for us to make mistakes without fear of the negative consequences which could cause further detriment to our cause. In this simulation exercise, our focus was centered around Track 2 diplomacy, which varies from Track 1 in that its capacity ultimately allows for more dialogue between the feuding parties. There are several reasons why this has become such an effective means of conflict resolution. The first is trust. Utilizing persons that are low threat and have no official ties to the governing parties involved in this dispute is a perfect way to start building the necessary trust. Once these parties have proven their worth and reliability, it is then more viable that negotiations can move forward. Over a period of time, this trusted relationship can be the vehicle that moves forward toward a productive outcome. If talks consisted of government officials well known for empty promises and nonsensical political rhetoric, it is not likely that any progress would be made, as we have seen many times before. It is also much easier to build a trusting relationship with someone whom you know to have the same goal in mind, which tends to be the case for the players who involve themselves in these talks. Another important aspect of Track 2 diplomatic talks is the ability to do so in a less stressed environment. It is important for ideas to be able to flow freely without fear of reprisals or obligations to perform in any certain manner. These are meant to be low-threat, low-risk settings where high-level officials remain absent, as well as any pressure that they would have undoubtedly caused. It is often easy for us to watch atrocities as they evolve anywhere around the world, in our local community, or wherever it may be, as we're reading or watching about them from the comfort of our own couch. It is actually not until we are confronted by someone or something a little more tangible that our emotions get involved and actually drive us into action. In the diplomatic settings that we're talking about of quote-unquote normal people, inevitably human nature and its psychological process will be tested when issues of inhumane acts are being presented and the solutions are being sought to these problems. On the contrary, a great deal of compartmentalization must exist for leaders or heads of state to be able to remain objective and be presented with just the facts as they're presiding over any sort of decisions for their country. This barrier that exists in them is often non-existent for those who do not operate in any sort of official capacity. Once the parties involved begin to understand where their opposers are coming from, it makes the relationship and trust previously mentioned grow, and the free exchange of ideas toward a peaceful resolution can actually flourish. With this ability to expound on ideas, the pool of solution also grows. Heads of state of any kind are typically confined to boundaries that must not be overstepped, which inevitably will stifle the ability for solutions to come about due to the lack of evolution of blending ideas and through crosstalk. In a Track 2 diplomatic setting, these ideas can be endless. They are bound only by time and the creativity represented within each participant. All of these factors come together in hopes for a positive outcome. Over the course of time, through the talks and trust building, confidence is being built. It is built in each other as well as in hopes for a peaceful end to a situation being discussed. So what does it actually take to become successful at the end of a conflict? There are many factors that contribute to the resolution process, but here are some that I want to highlight really quickly. First off, the rhetoric from both sides needs to stop. Continued threats of violence or sanctions, depending on the parties in question, have never proven to be a positive step toward peaceful resolutions. It's actually quite the contrary. And of course, this is only a natural reaction when someone feels threatened or violated. The reaction is not going to be to throw up the white flag of surrender. Secondly, it's also imperative that communication be present and effective. For example, I can communicate with a French person, but that doesn't mean that they can necessarily understand me or me them, which in turn can cause a serious miscommunication, and the entire message trying to be conveyed can be made in error. It is important that these efforts are done the same way under the context of familiarity with their disputants or adversaries, understanding what their life is all about, their work, their social settings, their religions, traditions, etc. For the reasons of credibility and also to make sure that the message being delivered is fully understood. Also, part of the effective communication relies on having a third-party mediator. This person must be trusted by both sides, and in order for them to be most effective, these talks should take place on some sort of neutral ground. And most of the times, it is also best if the third party is an outsider. This would eliminate any looming clouds of mistrust that might arise from someone who might be within one of the opposing groups. And all of the negotiation processes will be for nothing if there's not a consensus on what the final outcome should be. Each participant must agree on an end state, and this idea of group thinking will oftentimes provide just the momentum needed to change the dynamic into a positive direction. Track 2 diplomacy is not a new concept. It has been utilized for several prominent situations over the last few decades, and many resources and success stories can be found regarding how this process works and what you can expect if you ever encounter this type of conflict resolution effort. One resource is the one that has been discussed in this presentation already, and that is the simulation on the use of force in Chechnya. It's an exploration through the Track 2 diplomacy efforts. Another one I found is a video that you can actually find on YouTube, and it's of a panel discussing how Track 2 talks could actually benefit the ongoing tensions between Iran and the United States and some of its other potential adversaries. Alternative means to the peace process in Israel as well are discussed in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, negotiations by other means. And then for other examples of past success with utilizing Track 2 diplomacy, you can see there is an article titled Bridging Divides, Track 2 Diplomacy in the Middle East. These are all good resources that you can turn to. There's many more out there, either on the internet or in publishings. But as you can see, this is not something new that we are dealing with, but it is very beneficial when used in conjunction with the Type 1 diplomacy efforts. In this exercise, we were able to accomplish several objectives. The first was an introduction to Track 2 diplomacy. This was not one of the more well-known and talked about means of negotiating, but this exercise and the research that actually went into it has proven exactly how effective it can be. It has the potential to be a more effective means of conflict resolution than the more well-understood Track 1 all on its own. It can fill the gap that exists when there's a sense of continued tension and perceived stalemate in any of the resolution talks. This is also to say the best outcomes, though, will actually result when there is a combination of the two types of diplomacy. Secondly, as a part of the exercise participants, we were able to choose our characters. We've got to go into our roles, actually become the characters that we chose, which allowed us to develop a great understanding of why the Russians actually believe the way that they do, and also gave us an enlightenment to the fact that they actually see the inhumane acts against the Chechens to be wrong and want to give them the option to actually break off and form their own identity and statehood. Additionally, we were able to gain a greater understanding of the fear, the horror, and heartache the Chechens have gone through as they battle for their independence. All of this culminates in the fact that utilizing non-official members as a means to open the lines of communication between the Russians and the Chechen leaders is a good idea. All of the products produced by utilizing the Track 2 method that are actually mentioned in this presentation are or were missing in the relationship and negotiation processes. There is no trust. There's an increasing pressure to maintain a certain posture in the negotiation process. There's a severe lack of empathy and no viable solutions, and definitely no confidence in either party for a viable peace option. As you can see here, this is a review of what we actually covered in this presentation. We looked at the purpose of the simulation exercise, spent a lot of time looking at what Track 2 diplomacy is and how it can become a very important factor in conflict resolution. We looked at some of the critical factors that lead to a successful end, as well as a little blurb on some resources that you can turn to if you want to research more about Track 2 diplomacy, and then general conclusions that we came to at the end of this exercise. If you have any questions about anything that you have seen here, you can see there's my contact information on the screen. Thank you for your time.